First, it is a great pleasure for me to announce that Professor Shlomo Maital will be the head of the center. So the responsibility is on your shoulders, Shlomo.
Thank you.
And I would like to invite Shlomo to present before us the remarkable life story of Professor Tzvi Griliches. Please, Shlomo.
Thank you, Moshe. Thank you, everybody, for coming. A special thanks to Diane for coming from so far. In the next 20 minutes or so, we'd like to tell you the story of Tzvi Griliches in photos and in words. This is the improbable story of a small boy. There he is, middle of the first row. Small boy with impaired vision who survived the Holocaust, just barely, in Dachau. He made it to Palestine via Cyprus, closed the gap of 8 years of missed schooling in 6 months, became a famous Harvard economics professor, and did research that changed forever how Israel and the world invested in innovation and in research and development. And we'll tell his story in his own words. Tzvi wrote these words in January of 1976. So I quote from his autobiography. I was born in Kovna, Kaunas, Lithuania, on September 12, 1930. My father, Efim Griliches, was from Dvinak, now in Latvia. His family had a tannery there. He had finished a Russian gymnasium and studied chemical engineering in Germany. After an early youth in Kaunas, my mother went to boarding schools in Memel, Hanover, and Lausanne, where she learned German and French. At the time of her marriage, she was 19, more than 12 years younger than my father. After a brief stay in Dvinsk, the couple returned to Kaunas, where my father worked in the family's cigarette factory. I and my sister Ellen, 3 years younger than me, grew up in comfortable circumstances. This is Ellen and Father Efim. Russian was spoken at home. Lithuanian I learned from my nanny on the street. I was sent to a Hebrew school where the language of instruction was modern Hebrew. My family was not Orthodox, but observed the major Jewish holidays and considered itself Zionist. My earliest memories are dominated by two factors. I was cross-eyed and had to wear glasses early, leading to a lot of teasing from other children. I read early and widely, having acquired a library card at the age of 5 or earlier. Life was relatively pleasant for a child of well-to-do parents in Lithuania in the 1930s, and I have rather nostalgic memories of that time. But the world was marching on. In 1940, Lithuania was annexed by the Soviet Union. The factory was nationalized, though my father continued working there. I was sent to a Russian school, 4th grade. My own life didn't change much, but the level of tension and worry about me increased substantially. In late June 1941, the Germans marched in. In August, we were moved into the Kaunas ghetto, where we remained until 1944. The first years in the ghetto were not too difficult for me. I was shielded from much of the worry and was left alone to do a lot of reading. Father worked in the administration of the ghetto, while Mother became the effective breadwinner, going to work on the outside in a delousing establishment and wheeling and dealing, selling clothes and jewelry for the people in the ghetto and bringing in food from the outside. She also managed to get my sister out and placed her in a Catholic school. This is Tante Leah, who helped bring Ellen out, and this is Ellen in school in Munich in 1946. In the last year of the ghetto, my mother worked in a rubber factory on the outside, and I joined her there, sorting reclaimed pieces of rubber. Life in the ghetto was punctuated by repeated actions in which thousands of people were taken out to unknown but suspected fatal destinations. I witnessed some of them and hid out through others. As the war turned and the Germans started retreating, we dug a big hiding place under the cellar of our house. In June 1944, as the evacuation of the ghetto began, we descended into this hiding place called Malina, and we spent almost a week there before being blasted out of it by the Germans, having been turned in by somebody whom we had refused to include in the hiding place, because there were already 6 families crowded into one small room. After spending the night outside in a collection point in the middle of the burning ghetto, we were marched the next day to the railroad station, loaded on freight cars and shipped to Stutthof near Danzig. Stutthof was a large concentration camp. Men were separated from women there. I saw my mother for the last time there. She was to die of typhus there in the spring of 1945. My father and I, after a stay of several weeks in Stutthof, were shipped off to Camp Number 10 in Dachau, in Utting on Ammersee in Bavaria. Because I was tall for my age, I was 14 at the time, I went with the adults rather than being shipped to Auschwitz with the other children from Kaunas. Camp Number 10 was a work camp rather than an extermination camp. We were building a factory of prefabricated concrete plates for the construction of factories elsewhere. The camp consisted of about 800 Jewish men from Shauli and Kaunas in Lithuania, and 300 from Lodz in Poland. Food was scarce and it was winter. I worked in excavation and carrying cement bags. In early January 1945, my father died of malnutrition, hunger, diarrhea. As the first orphan in the camp, my situation improved somewhat. I became a sort of a mascot. With the war drawing to a close, we were evacuated on foot to Dachau, and from there marched toward the Alps. On May 2nd, 1945, I was liberated by Patton's Third Army in the valley of Wackkirchen outside of Bad Tolz. I was 14 and a half, and I weighed about 70 pounds. After some adventures, I found an uncle of mine in Munich and attached myself to him. After a year in Munich, I got tired of waiting for him to go to Palestine, and I joined a youth group in a displaced persons camp in Feldafing, Bavaria. This is Zvi on the right in the first row with the group, and this is the group, Hashomer HaTzair group in Fächerwald in Germany. After about 6 months there, we moved on the Underground Railroad toward Palestine, first to France and then to the port of Sète in a small boat towards Palestine. In February, our boat was intercepted and boarded by the British Navy and towed to Haifa. From Haifa, we were transferred to a camp in Larnaca, Cyprus, where I spent about 7 months doing largely nothing except relearning Hebrew and starting on English. This is Zvi in the camp in Cyprus. You can see the barbed wire behind him. Since the only books available were in English, I started reading them. By the end of my stay there, I was reading them fluently. I arrived in Palestine in September 1947 at the age of 17. This is the certificate releasing Zvi from the Atlit camp after Cyprus. Finding that none of my more or less distant relatives were ready to take me in, I went with my youth group to Kibbutz Elon in the Western Galilee in the framework of Youth Aliyah. I worked half a day, mainly in the orchards in the kibbutz, studied for half a day, mostly Hebrew, and the geography and history of Palestine. This is Zvi in Akko. And this is Zvi in Tel Aviv. And if you notice the ship in the background, it's the Atalena, right. After the UN resolution in November 1947, the security situation deteriorated rapidly. By January 1948, the roads to Elon were cut off, and supplies came in either by air or by sea to Nahariya and by foot from there. The blockade of the kibbutz ended with the conquest of Akko in May 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel. During these months, I spent many hours and nights on guard duty. In the fall of 1948, our year of Youth Aliyah ended, and the group I was with largely fell apart. Some, I among them, joined the army. I fought hard to get in despite my poor eyesight. I was defined as 4F and sent on leave without pay because types like me weren't needed at the time. I found a room and a job repairing streets in Tel Aviv. Just when that got going, I was called up again to the army. I had to give up the room and the job. And just as I got ready for basic training, I was discharged again from the army for health reasons. Having nowhere clear to go, I joined another youth group at a kibbutz where there were a few friends from my earlier group, and together we went through a series of places, Sarid, Dalia, and then established a new settlement, kibbutz Nachshonim, on the western border of Israel near Petach Tikva. Throughout this period, I was trying to find a way to resume my education. I initiated legal proceedings to receive 2 small plots of land that my parents had purchased years ago while in Lithuania. I also started taking correspondence courses from the British Institute, mainly in English and mathematics. In early 1950, a cousin of mine offered me to stay with her and her husband while preparing for the Bagrut matriculation exam as an external student. I left the kibbutz at that point, moved to Tel Aviv, and began studying full-time for this exam, a national high school completion exam. Since I had had almost no formal schooling since the age of 10, I had much to make up, especially in math and in Bible, a major subject of that exam. With some tutoring, I managed to pass that exam in June 1950. Not with flying colors, but considering that I tried to make up for 8 missed grades in less than 6 months, it was still quite an achievement. Having passed the exam and gotten my inheritance, I enrolled in the Hebrew University and moved to Jerusalem in the fall of 1950. This is Tzvi's student card at the Hebrew University. I'd wanted to get into the School of Agriculture, but I was too late for that. So I chose social science and concentrated on history. Among the teachers I had there, I was very much influenced by Professor Yaakov Talmon, a student of Karl Popper, who taught us to mistrust political movements that had the solution. At the time, I started thinking about going to the U.S. My uncle and sister, who had come out of Lithuania, joined my uncle in Munich. Instead of joining me in Israel, went to the U.S. in 1948. Also, the universities in the U.S. seemed to offer a larger variety and better opportunities for pursuing my educational goals. I applied to the University of California at Berkeley in agricultural economics and was accepted. I had chosen agricultural economics because to leave Israel at the time, one had to study something essential. Agricultural economics appeared to me the most attractive social science type of area of study among the various other essential possibilities such as engineering or accounting open to me at the time. I arrived at Berkeley and the U.S. in September 1951. This is reunion with Sister Ellen in New York, 51, and this is Tzvi's uncle and sister in New York at the same time.
The uncle's wife.
I did a BSc in agricultural economics in 2 years, having gotten a year's advanced placement for the Israel Matriculation Certificate and a year's credit for the time at Hebrew University, and I did a master's degree in an additional year. This is the young Tzvi at Berkeley. I also got married in 1953 to Diane Assail from Los Angeles. On the far left, Diane Assail at a music camp at Brandeis.
Zionist. Zionist music camp.
Yes, a Zionist music camp.
Before I met him.
And this is Tzvi with Diane at Berkeley. And this is their wedding in California in 1953. In 1954, we moved to Chicago, and I continued my graduate studies in economics at the University of Chicago. I received a PhD degree in 1957. This is Tzvi with his mentor, Theodor Schultz, a pioneer of human capital studies, and ultimately winner of the Nobel Prize in economics. Tzvi continues, we had 2 children, Eve and Mark. This is Tzvi with Eve, baby Eve. And this is Eve and Diane. And this is Mark and Eve. And Eve and Mark. And this is Tzvi with the beloved cat and the two kids in the bath. Tzvi continues, I started my research career working on the economics of technological change, the diffusion of hybrid corn seed, the increased use of fertilizer in U.S. agriculture, and the methodological and empirical problems of measuring technical change in agriculture, manufacturing, and the economy at large. The data showed how fast hybrid corn was spreading in Wisconsin and Indiana and Alabama. I tried to show, in fact, that hybrid corn was spreading in the areas where the hybrids had a higher superiority over the old variety of corn. And this was Tzvi's famous article on hybrid corn published in Econometrica, and along with a paper, which I'll refer to briefly, published in the next year, established the basis of measuring the astronomical social return to investment in research and development. Tzvi continues, I also looked at how much firms spend on research and development, trying to see how that advanced their productivity. We asked, how profitable is that sort of investment to the investors and to society as a whole? Economics is a little bit like archaeology in the sense that we can't really do major experiments. We cannot take people and take their money away, or go into the market and change prices and see how things happen. That's why you have to have model building. So we use mathematical models to describe what you think is happening, and then you go through the data and you try to fit those models to the data to see whether it's consistent. I moved from Chicago to Harvard in 1969. This is Tzvi at Harvard. And some of you may recognize the young student next to Tzvi before his hair turned white from a stint in the Knesset. Of course, this is Manuel Trachtenberg, and we'll hear from him later by video. Quoting Tzvi again, there were two reasons I chose to move to Harvard, a pull and a push. The pull was I was 39, full professor at the University of Chicago. If I turned down Harvard, I was making a decision to stay at Chicago forever. I wasn't ready for that. Also, we have a son, Mark, for whom there were much more resources for special education in the suburbs of Boston. And I could sense there was a vacuum at Harvard in econometrics. I could sense that I could make a difference. The social return was likely to be large. This concludes Tzvi's story in his own words. He was a distinguished Harvard professor for 30 years. He did pioneering research, and he trained generations of great scholars. But there's one important postscript to add. In 1991, Tzvi was awarded an honorary doctorate by the Hebrew University. And he valued that award very, very deeply. This is the ceremony where President Yoram Ben Porat, the late Yoram Ben Porat, makes the presentation to Tzvi Grilichus. And this is the description of the honorary doctorate. Tzvi is shown here with his beloved cat, Misha. Is that right?
Misha. Mm-hmm.
Misha, the cat. And again, and finally, after illness, he was quite ill here, Tzvi passed away on November 4th, 1999. Tzvi's distinguished former student Ian Cockburn and colleague Ernie Berndt helped organize Tzvi's papers, voluminous papers, together with Diane, and delivered them to the Harvard University Archive. Many people, I'm among them, many people believe that had he lived a few more years, Tzvi Grilichus would have been awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics. Grilichus published a paper in the Journal of Political Economy in 1958. That's 60 years ago. And he showed with impeccable care and I quote, at least 700% a year was being earned as of 1955 on the average dollar invested in hybrid corn research. 700%. Only someone with Tzvi's credentials and impeccable methodology could have made such a claim. And that astonishing finding helped Israel and the world understand that R&D was the road to innovation, to growth, and to prosperity. And the rest, as they say, is history. So this concludes the remarkable and improbable story of Tzvi Grilichus, Zichrono Livracha, in whose name Dayan and the Nieman Institute and the Technion have established the Tzvi Grilichus Research Data Center.